Thanks for joining us for this video installation in the Poetry Out Loud series. I'm Anina Moore. I'm one of the coordinators for Poetry Out Loud in Texas, and I'm joined by my co-coordinator, Derek Mudd.
Hi, everyone.
And today we are joining Jasminne Mendez. In this workshop, we will learn about the importance of pacing and how to effectively find pauses when performing poetry. We will look at helpful ways to mark our text for pauses, emphasis, and emotion, and use our voices and bodies to practice performing a poem in ways that will engage the audience and enhance the meaning of the piece. Jasminne Mendez is a poet, writer, and educator. She's the author of 2 multi-genre memoirs, including the award-winning young adult memoir, Island of Dreams. Her second YA memoir, A Bucket of Dirty Water, Memories of My Girlhood, and her debut picture book, Josefina's Habichuelas, from Arte Público Press, will be released in 2021. She is an MFA graduate of the Rainier Writing Workshop at Pacific Lutheran University, and we're so happy to have her with us today.
Hello, Jasminne Mendez. Thank you. Thank you all for having me. And thank you all for joining and watching this short lesson that I hope you will get a lot out of. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so we can jump right into the content of today's lesson. And yeah, so I titled this, as a lover of alliteration myself, The Power of the Pause. And we're going to take a look at some of the ways in which pausing when we are performing a poem can really help with the intention, the emotion, and just the meaning and the delivery of the piece in general and overall. So yeah, so we'll take a look at what is a pause, how we can mark the pauses when we have say a printout of our poem, the types of pauses, why do we pause? I think it's important to really kind of look at the purpose and why it's important to not just sort of speed read through a poem or just, get it all out, but really taking the time and being intentional about when we take a breath, when we pause, when we take a moment or a beat, as we say in theater. When specifically and how to know when to pause. We'll look at a very simple strategy. I think it's fairly simple for how to kind of figure that out. And then we'll look at a sample poem and the way that I've marked the pauses in that poem and practice it a little bit. So to begin, what is a pause, right? So it's as straightforward as it sounds. It's to take a beat or a breath between words, lines, or stanzas. And so I've given some examples here of just some very basic phrases that probably are part of a poem somewhere out there in the world. But so for example, we might put a pause between the words you and so. And so in this phrase, it might sound like, I miss you so much, right? So it's just a breath, it's just a brief pause, a brief silencing. But we hear that, right? We don't just speed read through it. I miss you so much, right? That's different than what I read, which is, I miss you so much, right? Just brief. We allow it to give, we give the line sort of a moment of silence. For many reasons, which we'll go into in just a few moments. But again, you think of it just as when you were maybe reading when you were smaller, when you were a kid, and they said, if you see a comma, take a breath or take a pause, right? Same thing here with these poems. And in this case, I put 2 pauses and I might make them a little bit longer. But again, we listen for that moment of silence. I miss you so much, right? Again, different than I miss you so much, or even different than the first one, I miss you so much. This one is even slower, right? I miss you so much, right? It feels a little over dramatic, I know, but we are going for a performance, right? Especially with these poems, we're going for some sort of way to engage our audience and to really give meaning to it. Also in the second one, in that moment of silence, we're sort of really focusing on the you, right? The you is what's important. I miss you so much, right? So thinking about that, what is the intention? What is the meaning in the line? And how are those pauses really going to emphasize that and really bring that to light? So How or types of pauses. So I'm very a big proponent of scoring or marking your poem. In this case, I might refer to it as a script because again, I'm sort of coming from that theater background. And in theater, we do this a lot when you're holding a physical script in your hand, and for the character that you're playing, for the part that you're playing, you do mark your script for different things. For pauses is definitely one of them, and for the intention, for your emotion, for beats that you're going to take. So those moments where maybe it might be a longer pause or a shorter pause. And again, if you're gonna like raise your inflection at the end. So there's lots of different ways you can mark your script, and we're really only focusing on pauses today, which I thought was a very straightforward and sort of simple way to look at this. So if someone hasn't told you to score or mark your poem, I highly recommend it. I highly suggest it because again, then you can practice. You can, as you rehearse and as you practice your poem, you can practice with those specific intentions in mind. And it might change, and that's okay. Which is why I talk about a little bit later. Make sure that you mark it with a pencil in case those markings need to change. But there are two, I mean, I tried to make this as straightforward and as basic as possible. I look at it as there can be short pauses and there can be long pauses. And hopefully your poem has sort of a combination of both of those. And so short pauses, I like to indicate with a forward slash, just one, a single one between words or lines. And again, it's a brief breath, or what I like to call a beat, maybe 1 to 2 seconds long. And it slows you down just enough, right? Just like you heard earlier, but it keeps the piece moving forward, right? So again, just a brief moment of silence, a brief breath, and it allows sort of the words that you just said to sink in and to kind of keeps, I like it because it keeps, you know, your listener hanging on, right? There's sort of that anticipation, that suspense going. So in this case, again, a short pause from a line from Langston Hughes' poem, Dream Deferred. What happens to a dream deferred, right? Brief, it's a breath, it's a simple, short, succinct pause. Versus the long pause, which I like to indicate with 2 forward slashes between words or lines, is a longer breath, 3 to 5 seconds max. You don't want to sort of really go, although there have been poets I've seen that take longer pauses, especially if they're like what I like to call on the roller coaster. They're sort of zooming up, right? They've taken you, they're up here on this emotional high, and then they need to take a longer beat because suddenly the poem's going to come down in some different way, or the intention or the emotion of the piece is going to change, it's going to shift. And so they'll be here, and right, they'll bring it down. And so the pause is longer. So that may be, you know, it may be longer than 5 seconds, but again, if you're being timed for this performance, you want to use your time wisely, right? So again, 3 to 5 seconds long, adds dramatic effect. As I said, helps you transition from one emotional sort of tenor or beat, one emotional area, right, to the next. If you're sort of shifting intention or shifting emotion, or if there's been a part in the poem where you're speaking really fast and really energetic, you've got lots of emotion and energy behind it, and then again, you need to come back down. And so you might take a longer pause there. And so in this case, using the same line as before, a longer pause might sound like this. What happens to a dream deferred? Now, I may not read the line that way, but there's an example, right? Again, it kind of like, right? And you can change that up. You might want to put the longer pause in different parts and play with it a little bit, right? You might say, what happens to a dream deferred? Oh, suddenly we've got like, oh, what does happen, right? We've lingered in that first sort of beat, that first what happens, right? Versus then in the to a dream. So again, different ways to approach it, and I encourage you to play with that. It can be a lot of fun. I find it a lot of fun to just play around with where to put the pauses, how long to make the pauses, and kind of going just with that flow and practicing it over and over. So why is it important to pause? And I've mentioned a couple of things already, but I think it really lets what you said sink in a little longer in the mind of the listener, and lets them sort of linger and sort of really make sure they're kind of like chewing on it, as I like to say it, in their mind and their brain. Allows you to take a breath. Again, if you've been saying a lot of words, or again, if you've come from a moment of high energy or high emotion, you know, you can take that breath, right? It allows you to kind of breathe and get yourself together as you move forward. It allows you to vary how repeated lines and phrases sound. So as you might know, as you might be aware, in poetry, oftentimes there's going to be some sort of anaphora or some sort of refrain or some sort of repeated line or stanza or word. right? That happens fairly regularly in a lot of poems that we find. And so if you create or add pauses in different sections or in different moments in that line that is repeated, or in those words that are repeated, it suddenly changes it up. So you're not just sort of saying the repeated line the same way every single time, right? But the emphasis is on a different part of the line, and the emotion of it or the intention behind it can change with each time that it's repeated. So I definitely encourage, if you have a poem that has repetition, play with where you put the pauses in those repeated phrases, in those repeated lines. It helps to vary the poem cadence, pacing and rhythm, or rhyme even, right? So because a lot of times, especially if something's in a very tight form, or if it does have a lot of end rhyme, especially, you might get into like that poet cadence, da 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 da. The cat in the hat sat on a mat, sat on a rat, right? We get sort of into that poetry cadence, like, and it's like, da, 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 quote the raven, nevermore, nevermore, right? And so instead of doing that, right, if you find yourself going there, if you've received some of that feedback, add a pause somewhere else, right? Add a long pause or a short pause to change up that rhythm and that sort of that cadence that we can sometimes just naturally fall into if something is an iambic pentameter, or if something has a lot of end rhyme, right? And again, we'll get to look a little bit at that a little bit later with the example. So I definitely encourage that. Or also, if you're trying to avoid hitting that end rhyme so strongly, so if I can think of an example, again, I'll just say like the cat in the hat sat on a bat, right? If I don't want to say the cat in the hat sat on a bat, right? I might say the cat in the hat sat on a rat, right? So now I'm not focusing so much on just like that, like hitting those end rhymes. And again, well, there's the poetry example, the example that I'll share by Maya Angelou at the end, I think will help show that a little bit more strongly as well. So again, if you want the emphasis to be on something else rather than like that sort of AB rhyme, for example, adding pauses can help achieve that. And then finally, which I know you've heard a little bit about already, I think, is to add a specific emotional quality to the piece. Pauses can definitely help with whatever emotional intention that you have in a piece. Something else I definitely highly recommend, if your poem kind of its tone or its emotion shifts throughout the piece, taking those notes. That's another way to mark your script, is like at the beginning where, the speaker is excited, in the middle they become calm, then they're confused. I think it's great to kind of make those annotations on the side of your piece to kind of guide you as you're delivering the poem, as you're practicing it. And again, that might change as you practice and learn a little bit more about your piece, but highly recommend that. So some of the emotions that might go, or that might connect with a pause, are sadness or melancholy. Again, simple phrase, I don't know. Right? Anger or frustration, I don't know. Right? And I meant to have, I think, one in between each one, right? There should be a forward slash between each word, right? That's different again than I don't know. I don't know. Right? 3 words, totally different intention, just because I put the pauses in different places, right? Excuse me. Could be tenderness that you're trying to show in this line. I don't know. Right? Suspense or surprise. I don't know. And it's in my body, it's in my face, but there's the pauses, right? We're looking at the pauses. And then confusion or uncertainty, which is normally like our first instinct with a line like this, is just confusion. But I've already shown you there's so many different intentions and emotional variances, right, that can exist with just these 3 words. And so with confusion and uncertainty, if you have a pause in between each word, it might sound like, I don't know, right? Again, short pauses here, 3 words, but we're varying, right, our emotional quality, our delivery of it, just by changing where we put the pause, as well as, right, how I'm saying the words. Some words I'm really I like to call punching. I'm making them really strong. Some words I'm elongating the vowels. So all of that as well plays a part in the emotional quality and the delivery of those lines. So now you're like, oh, this is great, but how do I know when to pause? Do I just make it up? Sometimes, yeah, right. You just got to kind of practice, right? So the straightforward ways, as you're looking at a poem and you're reading your poem and then looking at it to figure these things out, is you can sort of just a lot of it sometimes follow the punctuation marks that are on the page. That can be a definitely helpful guide as an initial way to decide when to pause. When you see a comma, excuse me, a semicolon, a colon, or a period, a question mark, an exclamation point, right? Those are signals usually from the author, from the writer, to at least take a breath, to take a moment. So feel free to use those as a guide, and definitely encourage you, right, to kind of lean into that. You can look at where the line on the page ends, but remember it's poetry, so it may continue. So it may not be appropriate to pause at the end of a line. You got to make sure to see if it's going to make sense to do so. But you know, and sometimes it is totally fine, right? Especially if it's like it ends, the line ends, and there is a punctuation mark, or you know that the idea does not continue on into the next line, and you've hit, you know, sort of an emotional, some sort of emotional tone, and then maybe it's going to shift. Or at the end of a stanza, right? A lot of but again, making sure that that previous line does not, you know, necessarily flow into the next one, because if you pause, and that's gonna, you don't want to mess up the meaning of the line or the intention of the poet in that case. When it feels natural. So one of the things we'll look at in my step-by-step way for how to do this is read your poem aloud and listen, right, to when you naturally paused. Oh, I naturally paused there. That might be a good place to include and like mark my script for a pause so that I remember it the next time, right, that I'm performing it or reading it aloud. When you want to add emotional effect, like the emotions that I mentioned before, right, to build up to a moment, if there's a specific line that you like, yes, the audience really needs to sit with that. They need to think about it. They need to chew on it. They need to feel it in their bones. Then you can write to be like, I'm going to pause after I've said this line, after I've said these 4 words. And again, these pauses, as you saw before, can happen in between words. They don't have to happen at the end of a complete thought or at the end of a complete sentence. They can happen between words. And that's, again, is going to add to the emotional delivery, to the engagement and performance of your piece. And then again, when the emotional tone of the poem shifts. So if you're like, if you're in a stanza or in a couple of lines that feel angry and you're delivering them angry, and then you move to calm, you know, you want to take a breath, you want to take a beat to sort of allow the audience to see, to signal that shift, right, in intention, to signal that shift in tone. Excited to sad, confused to confident. Any kind of emotional shift will likely warrant even just a brief pause, breath, before you keep going to the next beat, to the next moment. And so, yeah, as I said, this is what I do when I'm working through a poem, whether it's my own poem or someone else's poem. I started, much like you all, I started in middle school, just reading other people's poetry out loud. I did UIL, poetry prose competition all through high school. I did slam in college. And so it always started with just reading the words aloud on the page. And then making notes of those natural pauses. Sometimes it can happen just in your mind. Sometimes you can write it down as you're going. But I like to read it aloud at least once, not taking any notes, not doing anything, just listening to myself read it aloud. And I do this with my own poems to this day. As I'm writing them, as I'm revising them, I read them aloud for the rhythm and the cadence, and figure out, you know, sometimes I'll write them on the page specifically, excuse me, in certain ways where I think the pauses would occur. And then ask yourself, do I like the way that sounds, right? In your initial read through, read aloud, did you like that? And if not, that's fine, because you're still just practicing. And then read it aloud again, this time with a specific intention. Now that you've read it, you've kind of really been listening to yourself and how you read it the first time. Think about what specific emotional quality or pacing or rhythm, right, you want to read it with this next time around. Sometimes I'll think in my head, oh, I want to speed up these 4 lines, right? Or I want to slow down this one section. And I try that and see what happens. And again, now I'm really listening. Where did the pauses happen this time, this next time that I read it aloud? And don't be afraid to experiment. That's really like my biggest advice, is taking 1 or 2 lines, 1 or 2 stanzas, and just reading them over and over in 20 different ways: excited, happy, scared, confused, with a long pause, with a short pause, with a pause between this word, with a pause between these 3 words, and just seeing what feels good, what sounds right. Some things will work, a lot of it won't. That's okay, right? But really listening to yourself as you're doing that, so that then you can go back and really kind of mark with your pencil, mark those forward slashes, the long pause or a short pause, And again, mark it with a pencil, because it's, you might change it. You might change it and suddenly be like, oh no. But I do, even when I've marked it, you know, even if I've marked just one stanza, I'll go back and read that stanza again before I move forward to the next one, right? To see where I've marked with my markings and see if I still like it that way. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna try. Excuse me. So this is actually, I've just taken 2 short sections, the beginning and the end of one of my favorite poems by Maya Angelou, Still I Rise. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read it without the markings. I'm going to pretend that my purple forward slashes are not there. And then I will read it as it's marked. And so we can look at how that emotion and how that delivery changes in those two moments. So give me a second. I'm going to take some water because I just choking on whatever dust is in my office. And this poem requires my energy and full vocal quality. So Maya Angelou is one of my favorites. I hope that you're familiar with her work. If not, do check out more of her writing. I know that there's some poems of hers in the Poetry Out Loud anthology. So highly recommend her work. And she also, there's a lot of videos of her online reading her work, and it's very, very powerful. So this is the first 2 stanzas of Still I Rise. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. Just a straight read through, right? Nothing too fancy. Second time, I'm going to read it. I'll read it with the forward slashes, which is where I indicated that the pauses would take place. And as you'll notice, many of them do coincide with the end of a line or with a punctuation mark, as I mentioned to you in the ways to when do you pause. And that's okay. You can leave the commas there, and that might be enough for you. For me, I like to add the forward slashes because, again, sometimes it might be a long pause, sometimes it might be a short pause. So this is me reading it as I've marked it with the forward slashes. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. So again, just slowed it down. What those pauses helped me do is it helped me slow the piece down and let some of that language really sink in my mouth and in your brain, right? Because that's what poetry is about. It's about the richness and the beauty of language. And oftentimes poems will have a lot of images. And if you run through those, you're going to lose your audience, right? You're going to sort of lose everybody. And they're like, what was that poem about? But if you take the time, you slow it down, you give those beats, those lines, those images, that moment to sit and linger, we're going to really hear them. We're going to see that imagery, right? We're going to really see those moons and those suns and those tides, right? We get to really sit and simmer with the language when we add some pauses and take those beats. And so, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that pauses can help do is vary the cadence of some of those repeated lines. And in this poem in particular, as you can see, I'll rise, I'll rise. And that gets even more intense as the poem goes on. She continues repeating this, I'll rise, I'll rise. And so we're gonna take a look at the end here. And this is the last section, the last stanza. And again, first time I'm just gonna read it straight through, and then I'll go ahead and read it with how I've marked it with the pauses. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. Now remember, this is the end. Is that how you want your poem to end? Right? Sort of the way that I read it, right? Not necessarily. It could work, but you want to really like, you want to hit it. That ending has got to, you got to come with it at that end, right? Really let that sink in. So in thinking about that, I marked the piece the way that I did on the page. And so I'll read it again with that, those pauses scored. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. So, and even now as I was reading, I was like, oh, I don't know if I would put that in the hope of the slave. I probably wouldn't chop off that hope in the of. So see, that happens, right? If I go back now, I would change that I am the dream and the hope of the slave, right? It might be more like I am the dream and the hope of the slave. See, now I'm still like, I don't know, right? So I got to play with it. I would want to play with it a little bit more. But that ending with that longer pause between I and rise, that to me felt more powerful than just I rise, I rise, I rise, right? Two words, but you got to find ways to make each one of them different, right? Especially in a performance. I rise, I rise, I rise, right? So whether it's with pauses or whether it's with the delivery of the line, the I, you emphasize rise, long pause, short pause, right? Thinking about that and what is that impact that you want to have on your listener, right? Especially in that very end. And even here, when we've got bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I could totally get into that poetry cadence rhythm that I talked about earlier, right? Especially with those end rhymes and the way that the rhythm of those two lines are. So again, it could sound like bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. But with pauses, right, I can change it up. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. So again, now I'm not necessarily like da 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 da, and right, and even the rhyme isn't as in your face necessarily, right? We know if we listen closely that gave and slave are rhyming words, but I haven't fallen into that sort of poetry cadence rhythm that just immediately gives it away. And sometimes, you know, your listeners might tune out when it's gotten into that like right? But adding those pauses again helps break up that rhythm, adds some variety, a different emotional quality to your performance and to the delivery of the piece, and it helps our understanding, I think, as well. So yeah, so that's what I've got to say. Pauses are important, right? You don't want to speed through your reading. You want to be sure that you've got some good emotional quality and delivery, some variety. Pauses help provide variety, slow you down, allows you to take a breath, and to let the audience really linger and sit with the imagery and the language that you've just spoken aloud. So practice, practice, practice out loud, in front of a mirror, in front of family and friends. Definitely experiment and try different pauses in different places until it sounds right, until it feels right. And I know sometimes when I'm in front of an audience, which you probably won't be, but just, you know, imagine there's this, you know, big sort of auditorium audience, it changes a little bit too, but at least the markings and the scoring, if you do that in your poem, can really help guide you as you're there. And I know for me, it kind of helps alleviate some of those nerves, because I feel really prepared, like, okay, I've prepared this poem in this way, and if nothing else, I'm going to read it with the way that I've prepared it. And so it makes me feel better to know that is, those markings are there to guide me. And definitely experiment with short and long pauses. I will caution, you don't want to have too many, right? Because you don't want to chop up your poem so much that suddenly the audience is like, what did she say? You know, there's just like, I am so sorry, right? Like all of a sudden we're just like sort of dragging on, like we're like, wait, what? I forgot the beginning of that sentence. I don't know. So really think about that. You don't want to have too many or too many long pauses, especially because you want to sort of keep that rhythm going. But do definitely be intentional about where you pause and how long you pause in certain areas. So I do hope that was helpful and useful to you, and gave you some tools to try and to use and to practice with as you work on your poems. And I wish you all the best of luck. It's an exciting program.
Thanks, Jasmine. I think it was really great that you also kind of demonstrated how you can go back and forth and play with stuff like that you've, you know, already examined 100 times to get a sense of how to provide a unique sense of the poem. I have to say that sometimes in Poetry Out Loud, we have students who are coming from different schools. They've picked different poems. I mean, they've picked the same poem, and you can really see the different ways that each student approaches them. Like it's no foul for everyone to be bringing the same poem, because we're going to see different ways of presenting them. And that's part of the artistry that the students get to explore here. So thanks for doing that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jasmine, for being here. And thanks for watching this video. Any final words, Jasmine, you'd like to give?
No, just thank you. Please continue reading, writing, loving poetry. So I huge encouragement and shouts outs and to you and the work that y'all are doing. So thank you.
Thanks for watching this video. We hope you'll watch the other videos of the series as well. And good luck in your competitions.